Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I am the Director of Programming for Expo Chicago and the Editor-in-Chief of The Scene, Chicago's International Journal for Contemporary and Modern Art. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues is a year-round series of panels, symposia, and provocative artistic discourse featuring leading artists and curators on the current issues that engage them. Today, we are thrilled to be presenting The Hospitality of Violence, featuring Manilow Senior Curator and Director of Global Initiatives at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Omar Kholeif, and artist Michael Rakowitz, who is represented by Rhona Hoffman at the Gallery in Chicago, the other in Chicago, and Jane Lombard Gallery in New York. This is coinciding with his first ever museum survey in the world at the MCA, which Omar curated. So please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. Couple of words of warning or a note is these lights are really bright, so we can't see you, and which is kind of great because it's like you're all naked, or something, and we can imagine whatever we want to imagine, and we don't know who's there because we can't see. And another note is that both of us have been working really hard and probably haven't slept that much, but we are going to kill this for you. And the third thing is, if I do slur, it's only because I'm on quite a few drugs for this broken foot, but that's no excuse because this is professional. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, give a brief introduction to what we're going to discuss today. The talk is called The Hospitality of Violence, and that comes very specifically from some of the themes of the exhibition that I've organized of Michael's work, along with my colleague Aaron Toll, who's here today. And it is a show called Backstroke of the West, which seeks to consider how hospitality and hostility are interlinked. And that theme really emerged from me getting to follow Michael's work from a period since 2007 to the present. And when we started our discussions over 2 years ago about planning the show, it occurred to me that Michael was the consummate host, this incredible host. But everything that he did seemed to unbuckle something about some form of political conflict, specifically in relation to his Iraqi heritage. And so the exhibition is anchored around, I would say it's almost a retrospective of sorts. It is anchored around many, many themes. But as you enter the exhibition, it's as if you're walking into a city. And that's how I like to think of it, as a cityscape. And within that, there are moments where there is great hospitality that is explored and hospitality that is critiqued. And that is some of the things we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to be the person that we want to hear the most from because he's the genius here and the great storyteller. So I want to hand over to you to begin, because I think we're going to start with a brief clip. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, thank you, Omar, for that wonderful introduction. The clip we're about to see is one that I've only shown once, and I wasn't even in attendance when it was shown. It was made for a panel discussion that happened in 2012 the question was what happens when a host becomes hostile, and it was in the context of Stephanie Smith, the chief curator at the time at the Smart Museum of Art. She had curated an exhibition called Feast, Radical Hospitality in Contemporary Art. And so what you'll see in this video, it was recorded on location in Afghanistan, where I was doing a project for Documenta, which raised all these other issues about being a bad guest and inside the space of a good host. And it was posed towards Anna Pravatsky, who was one of the other artists in the exhibition that was dealing with ways to more or less heal moments of awkwardness and hostility in public situations and in spaces that are supposed to be welcoming. So I'm going to try, which way do I point? This way or that? What if a host turns hostile? It's a good question. I think it probably happens quite a lot, probably every day. In my case, it's not in my nature to be hostile. I find myself to be a relatively polite and accommodating person. In my work, I would say that I'm also accommodating. But I'd like to maybe propose that in the work that I do, that I'm a purveyor of discomforts. That is to say that the things that happen in my work happen through accommodation and hospitality, but there are some pretty fucked up things at play. Take, for instance, the project that I did with Creative Time this past fall, Spoils. What I did in that work was I collaborated with a chef at an Upper East Side restaurant in Manhattan called Park Avenue. And in that piece, what I really wanted to do was to look at the way that menus in high-end restaurants will often tell you where your food is coming from, where the beef is harvested from, the farm where your arugula is grown. And it's meant as something that it's used to make the customer feel good. And I wanted to figure out a way to make the diner feel bad. So what I decided to do was to have listed on that menu a dish that involved Iraqi date syrup. And so the chef put together this really great dish, which was using an Iraqi dessert called debiswarashi, which was Iraqi date syrup mixed with tahini. And the thing that he served on top of it was a nice chop of venison. So he described it as the American deer hunt meets the Iraqi date harvest, which I liked very much. But then the dish was served on plates that belonged to Saddam Hussein and that were looted by Iraqis in the aftermath of the shock and awe period. And they're actually used in Iraq by normal Iraqis as like their daily dishware. I'd found these on eBay being sold by an American soldier who was based in Iraq and also by an Iraqi refugee who was based in Detroit. So the diner is put into a situation where they actually have to take a position on their ethics, whether or not they'll consume the dish. So in as much as the dish is about consumption, it's also about refusal. And I liked the uncomfortable situation that diners were put into. It explored the triangulation between the diner's tongue, the sweetness of the date syrup, and then the bitter surface upon which the meal was served. And so there wasn't anything about comfort there. And in fact, I guess the restaurant could be seen as being a hostile host. I think it also shows up in other projects that I've done, like the
Project Return, where I import dates from Iraq, and also An Enemy Kitchen. The title itself is something that's antagonistic and actually looks to really call out, I think, the situation here in Chicago, where you have tens of thousands of Iraqi refugees living. Many of them own restaurants, and they're all listed as being Middle Eastern or Mediterranean restaurants, and Iraq doesn't border on the Mediterranean. But this is a sad kind of veiling that occurs as a result of American xenophobia and the fear that a lot of immigrants and refugees from that part of the world feel when they move here, that they can't disclose where they're from. So it actually becomes an unveiling, but it also is called Enemy Kitchen, and calling it Enemy Kitchen when it's a hospitable situation where food is being served is one that's also a double meaning, because the people who are on the other side of the counter who are serving your food are American vets of the Iraq War, who are making the food and serving it with Iraqi refugees. So the two perceived enemies, the actors on both sides of the conflict, are inside that little truck working with each other and mostly getting along. But what I find interesting in the background there is that the antagonized and the antagonizer are both there, and anything can happen. But I guess, there's a lot of things I think about in my work in terms of my own experiences in the world. I think that there's a way of saying I love you and meaning I hate you. I think that I'm interested in what happens when one makes an enemy. Eminem says, he made an enemy. Good, that means you stood up for something. He also says a really nice thing about a legion of Slim Shadys working in Burger King, spitting on your onion rings. And then I also think about Hanan Ashrawi, a Palestinian politician and activist who, in the Second Intifada, was on TV in discussion and debate with an Israeli politician. It was in 2000. And the Israeli politician was complaining about the I guess, attacks on Israeli soldiers in Hebron. And Hanan Ashrawi said, when you're in Hebron, you're our guest. And whenever you're anywhere in Palestine, you're our guest. And I like this concept of the Israeli-Palestinian war being reduced down to this idea of the Israelis just being really bad guests. I find myself often in these situations where I go to places in the world, and I know that the provenance of who I am, where I'm from, just immediately labels me as a bad guest. It doesn't matter what my politics are. It doesn't matter what my sympathies are. I mean, all of that's just for me. It doesn't matter to anybody else. But I do wonder sometimes about being the bad guest and knowing I'm the bad guest, but then still being received with generosity and hospitality, and how wonderful and awkward that all feels. It feels like it is transformative as an experience, and that it kind of creates a situation where you avoid or dispel myths about being hated, but you also recognize in some parts of the world, or I recognize in some parts of the world, that I'm basically malignant. I'm a disease, and I've entered the body of the host, and I'm being fed, and I'm being taken care of, when in fact I might need to be just extracted and dealt away with, if we're going to look at larger geopolitics or larger failures in terms of manners and etiquette. So I do have this question for Anna Pravaki, whose work I admire quite a lot, and who I admire quite a lot as a person in terms of ethics and etiquette. And that is, what do you do as a bad guest? When you know you're a bad guest, and you're in the the house of the host, or you're in the space of the host. Who knows, or if they knew who you were, would know you're a bad guest. And how should the host act? And so I guess I'd close out with a kind of one of my favorite lines from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Hi, how are you? Salam, salam, salam. It's my favorite line from Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's from an episode called Porno Gill. And in this episode, Larry is with Cheryl, and they go to a dinner at a porn star's house, this guy named Gil Bang. And when Larry and Cheryl arrive late, Larry is asked to take off his shoes like all the other guests. And he says he doesn't want to, that it makes his feet cold, and he insists on keeping his shoes on, much to the chagrin of the host, who kind of keeps it together, but she's sort of gritting her teeth. And then later on in the night, a glass breaks, and Larry tells everybody to stay away from the broken glass because it'll cut their feet. And the host says, the glass doesn't really affect you though, does it, Larry? No, because you have your fucking shoes on. When you come into my house, you play by my rules. You take off your fucking shoes. You and your stupid little fucking tennis shoes.
So, in that video, I found myself thinking about all these things, but also finding myself in this situation where I was in Afghanistan, which was one of the positions of the 2012 documenta as drafted by the artistic director, Carolyn Christof-Akargiev. And I went there completely aware of all the different frictions that were created by an artist from the United States who is of Iraqi background, but still my whole process of getting the visa had to originate from the United States, going through the Goethe Institute in Germany, and just feeling this incredible hospitality, standing in front of the niches where the Bamiyan Buddhas used to be, and doing this project that we might get to talk about called What Dust Will Rise. But feeling like that video captured so many different moments in time where I was thinking about this origin, the etymology of the word of hospitality and hostility, which both come from hospice and hostis in Latin, which mean guest, stranger, enemy, host. All those things wrapped up together. But you think about the hospitality industry having some kind of etymological relationship to this notion of who is an enemy. It fuels so many of my works.
I mean, the film, in a sense, is a distillation of everything that all the projects, actually, because you mentioned Enemy Kitchen, you mentioned Spoils, you mentioned the context is around What Dust Will Rise. But one word that struck me there was this negotiation of the word comfort, and the idea of trying to create spaces of comfort for those who are unable to attain that. And there's in the exhibition, the earliest project that is on view is one called Parasite, which you developed when you were a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is an ongoing project called Parasite, which you see here. And I'd like you to take us through that, and especially take us through the specifics of the broader context by which you were trying to relate that to other situations which you had mentioned to me yesterday. It's not simply about trying to create a homeless shelter, it's about a whole other swath of references for you too.
Yeah, well, the project really got its start when I was in Jordan on an architectural residency through MIT. And it was during that time that I realized that I was going back to an Arab country and it was the first time anybody in my family had been back to a place in the Middle East that wasn't Palestine since they left Iraq in 1946. My mom's side of the family is from Iraq. And so being in Jordan and being in Amman, I was especially aware of the fact that, yes, even 1998, or 1997 actually, there were a huge amount of Iraqi refugees who had settled there after the first Gulf War. And I was very interested in trying to do something around the context of refugee status, of the fugitive, of this notion of being elsewhere, the diaspora. And so I ended up doing all this research on the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin. It was an architectural residency. And one of the things that amazed me was the way in which the tents were set up each night to take into account the wind patterns that move through the desert. And so I was looking at the Bedouin, but then I was also thinking about these other moments of dispossession in the Middle East. And right before I left for Jordan, I had looked at a book on Palestinian refugee camps. And one of the photographs in the book showed a family from Dahisha whose house had been, which is near Bethlehem, and so their house had been bulldozed by the Israelis. And inside this refugee camp, they rebuilt that house, but using more urgent and sort of makeshift materials. So like the zinco that's used to make the roofs of some of those temporary houses, but then plastic cans and bottles. It was so beautiful, this bricolage, that essentially made this ghost appear of the house that had been there before. It was this architecture of resistance and of opposition. And so with this experience of looking at the Bedouin in mind, and then me thinking about Palestinian refugees, and then realizing that my own family, who were forced to leave Iraq in 46 because of the emergence of Zionism as an ideology on one side and the emergence of Arab nationalism on the other, that this notion of diasporic and not belonging was very much central. So when I was walking along Tremont Avenue in Boston, when I returned after spending part of the winter in Jordan, I saw a homeless person sleeping underneath the vent of a building. And the warm air coming from that building on this cold night was what was keeping him alive. And in French, vent is spelled the same as vent, and it means wind. And so it was this other kind of wind that was coming into this world of the diasporic and the nomad. And it was coming from the very thing missing in the homeless person's life. And with this juxtaposition of different kinds of nomadism, the urban nomad who is not homeless by tradition, but rather by consequence, it more or less just happened on that spot where I envisioned these shelters using these makeshift materials, harnessing what was invisible, which was that air.
And it's meant to be a kind of $0 project where you basically make this using tape, gaffer tape, or some durable tape, scissors, and garbage bags. And one thing that Michael does on every winter is he goes out into the streets of Chicago and activates this project in some way, or places ads in magazines such as these, including, for example, Streetwise, which is what we'll be doing during the duration of this show, which is about giving the simple instructions about how you can build such a specific shelter. And for me, this project really is about kind of a suturing, a kind of a healing of a very specific wound, which is how social and economic systems fail huge parts and huge swaths of society, and how the political ecology in which we live creates such human destruction. And that is a part of the context of another project that Michael does, which is from what we call the Iraq cycle, called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, which I'm going to hand over to Michael to talk about the genesis of this. And this was actually the main, or one of the main or initial introductions to Michael's work that I had really been captured by when I had the privilege to travel to the Sharjah Biennial when I was a graduate student. So I'll hand over to you.
In 2003, in April, I sat in front of the television like many people did, watching the American invasion of Baghdad unfold, and I saw the same images that many of you have seen of the looting and the aftermath of the looting of the National Museum of Iraq. And this was one of those moments where it seemed like the first moment of pathos had opened up in the war. that it didn't matter if you were for the war or against the war, everyone agreed that this was a catastrophe. And it had much deeper allegorical, metaphorical meanings to what was happening to the world rather than just something that was happening in Iraq. So it went from being this local scenario to being something that was universal, that the first examples of writing were lost, the first urban codes and laws were lost. And it wasn't simply an Iraqi problem, it was a human problem. And so when I saw these votive statues disappearing, many of which are sort of like this one on the end over here, with its arms folded, what people would do in ancient Babylon, worshippers would go to the Akitu or the temples, and they would place a votive statue like that in front of the shrine, to the god that they were worshiping. And you would pray, and then you would leave, and that statue would stay, and that statue kind of looked like you. And so the idea was that you never stopped praying, that little guy was there to pray for you. And I thought about the disappearance of these little figures, but then the disappearance of the bigger figures of the Iraqi bodies that were going missing and were also being stolen, their lives stolen, their dreams stolen. And I was actually quite furious when the outrage around looted antiquities did not translate into an outrage about stolen bodies and stolen lives. And so it became a kind of site-specific project for me because I had an exhibition coming up at Lombard Free Gallery in early 2007, and I had wanted to do something that was able to kind of throw on the side, this notion that everything was still business as usual in a place like Chelsea. Like you could walk in Chelsea in 2006 and not know that we were living in a war culture. And so I knew that it was the existence of an antiquities, ancient art market that allowed for those artifacts to be looted in the first place. And so I wanted to play with that economy as well, with contemporary art, and to kind of create a ghost that could haunt collections and look back on a world public with these votive statues standing in front of us now, almost asking these questions like a sphinx. And so the artifacts are it's an ongoing project. I'm using the databases of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago and Interpol, where I and a team of assistants has now grown to 27 different pairs of hands here in Chicago who have made these works with me, to make the more than 8,000 that are still missing from the Iraqi Museum. And unfortunately, it's a project that's going to outlive me and my studio as more of the archaeological sites and the museums continue to be looted in what I believe is, a continuation of the Iraq War.
And just a little kind of anecdote also is that when you see the installation at the museum, you'll hear a soundtrack, and it's a Deep Purple song. And that's because I believe Dr. Donnie George, the director of the Iraqi Museum, was at one point in a Deep Purple tribute band. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, what was incredible to me was this man's story. I read a couple of things. The art newspaper did really beautiful coverage of the aftermath of the looting, and they followed the story of Dr. Donnie George. And so there was also an article in the New York Times called The Ghost in the Baghdad Museum, where you learn different things, where he used to avoid Ba'ath Party meetings, because that was the only way he could hold his position of power in order to participate directly on excavations, which is something a museum director doesn't usually do. But he just hated the idea of having to be in these meetings talking about political ideologies he didn't believe in. And to make extra money, he was a drummer in a band called 99%, which stands for 99% of excellence. And so what you hear is an Arabized version of Smoke on the Water when you go see the exhibition.
One of the great accomplishments that Michael has recently attained is that he won the 4th Plinth Commission in Trafalgar Square in London, which is undoubtedly the most important piece of public art in Great Britain. And it's, kind of incredible. I mean, I always say Michael is based in Chicago, but he's an international artist working globally, and for all of us living here, it is a privilege to have him here, not only as an artist, but also as an incredible teacher at Northwestern, helping shape the minds of numerous generations of future artists with his very particular form of storytelling. And this particular piece has, although it's from The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, has its own very particular story, and I want to hand over to Michael to tell us about that.
Well, one of the things I hadn't mentioned was that, the centerpiece of The Invisible Enemy is these reconstructions of the artifacts, full scale, life size, but I use the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs that one finds here in the United States, and also the Arabic English newspapers that are given away for free to these immigrant communities from the Middle East. And so it more or less enlists these fragments of cultural visibility, which are largely disposable, to construct these things that are, for now, all intents and purposes, invisible. And so most of those things are made out of papier-mâché, but of course the fourth plinth is going to be outside in London, where there's a lot of rain.
For 2 years.
For 2 years, so I can't use papier-mâché. So there's another project that we might get to talk about that dealt with date syrup. But date syrup, 99% of the time that you find it in stores, whether it says product of Lebanon or whatever else, it's always product of Iraq. And there's a bigger story to that. But I'm using date syrup cans that are essentially coming out of Iraq to make this reconstruction of the Lamassu that was destroyed by Daesh in 2015. It used to stand at the Nergal Gate in Nineveh. And so when I was doing research, when I was invited to propose something, I found out that the fourth plinth was built in 1841 for a statue of a king, and the city went bankrupt and weren't able to pay for it. And then I found out that it was actually 14 feet in length. And it kind of was an amazing moment of serendipity, because at that time I was researching what it would take to reconstruct this Lamassu, and that Lamassu was exactly 14 feet long. And it was excavated for the first time by a Brit named Austin Henry Layard in 1849. So the fact that the Lamassu appeared, when the statue of the King of England kind of disappeared, was something that was interesting to me. And so when it gets positioned on the fourth plinth, it will be facing southeast towards Nineveh, hoping to return.
And that goes up in May or April 2018?
Actually, late March 2018.
Late March 2018. So some of you may have enjoyed the food that came out of the Enemy Kitchen food truck, which is stationed currently outside of the Museum of Contemporary Art. And this is a project by Michael that he began in 2003. And in terms of giving context around this, I would like to begin by just saying that it is a food truck that sells, or gives away, Iraqi food. The food is prepared by Iraqi refugees and living here, and the sous chefs and the servers are American war veterans. So there's this kind of inversion of power that occurs within this food truck. But it's also about a very specific kind of hospitality, because the plates that people eat off are paper replicas of plates that were looted from Saddam Hussein's palace, which we might talk about in a second. So again, it raises this question about what does it mean to eat from the plate of the enemy? There's all these layers to that. But the project actually had its genesis in something very different, which was Michael's mother saying to him that there were no Iraqi restaurants left in New York. And so him and his mother went on a journey. Tell us about that.
Well, the awareness that my mother had that the only access that I had to Iraq in real time was watching these horrible news reports of buildings being blown up was something that she thought was so vulgar, and also pointed to the dehumanization of the Iraqi people. And so she said that in 1991, and I kind of found out what she meant by 2002. as the drums started to beat towards war. And in 2003, just as the war was beginning, my mother and I began this project called Enemy Kitchen, where we have more or less mobilized her recipes and her mother's recipes as a way to create a platform for resistance against the war. And so I explained this a little bit yesterday, but the most gratifying experience have been, working with communities and individuals that are a little less prone to be polite. And kids are kind of in that category. And this one moment happened in 2006, which is pictured here actually, where I was invited to work at the Hudson Community Guild in Chelsea, New York. And if you go to the galleries in Chelsea, you'll always pass by these housing projects. And most of the people who live there are of Latina and African-American and Caribbean descent. And many of them had family that were stationed in Iraq as soldiers. And those principals of their high schools and middle schools would not allow for the war to be spoken about in class because it was potentially too explosive an issue, too difficult for them to talk about. And I thought that this was a really bad idea. And talking about 2006 at this point, and 5 years of these kids' lives have been growing up in a war culture. And nobody's ever asked them about it. And so I wanted to kind of create a space where fearless listening could enable fearless speaking, and I wouldn't necessarily proselytize or mediate, but I knew that this food was really intricate. It takes a lot of time to make it, and I'm always interested in a public art that exposes its making. And it creates a scenario where everybody's producing it together and things slow down. So when you're making kubba, which is this Iraqi dumpling, you might as well be making really, really sort of tedious clay sculpture. And so the idea that you would then eat this sculpture was something that I thought was this magical communion. And so these kids started making this food with me, and they would open up and start to talk about the war. And then the third week in, there was one kid who walked in and said, why do we have to make this nasty food? They blow up our soldiers every day, and they knock down the Twin Towers. And I didn't want to interfere, and so then this other kid, Hashim, said, the Iraqis didn't knock down the Twin Towers, Bin Laden did. And then another kid from the Stoke said, it wasn't Bin Laden, it was our own government. And so in that one moment, you had this panoramic snapshot of all the different sort of avenues of information. And, the best thing to be in the Bush era was a conspiracy theorist, And so...
Maybe now too.
We've not left the Bush era, everybody.
Post-truth, hashtag post-truth.
And so the other really great thing about these students was that after 10 weeks of cooking with them, I was about to head to Chicago, and they said, you're going to leave us, and we know all about your cuisine, you know nothing about ours. And they said, we would like to teach the last class. And I thought it was a brilliant idea. And they asked me, do Iraqis make southern fried chicken? And I did this sort of like roll through the Rolodex in my mind of my mother's recipes, and I realized there was nothing like southern fried chicken. I'm like, no, there's nothing like it. And they said, we're going to invent Iraqi southern fried chicken. And so the next week, they marinated the chicken in Iraqi baharat spices, in date syrup. They taught me how to do a shake and bake, which is kind of disgusting, but it was delicious. Iraqi fried chicken was born, so those unpredictable and tangible things happen in that project.
This is the Enemy Kitchen food truck, just for you to see. So this is another project which actually, in some ways, emerges from Enemy Kitchen to some degree. And Michael actually described it in the video that we watched. So I don't know, because we have little time if we want to talk about it. Can I summarize it and then we show the clip?
Sounds perfect.
So basically, as Mike mentioned in the video, he was invited to work with Creative Time with a chef called Kevin Lasko at a restaurant called Park Avenue. And he was very interested in a number of different things. One was how these high-end restaurants told you where your arugula came from, where all these things came from. And so he decided that he wanted to make a dish that was on Iraqi date syrup. But to take it a next step further, he had also heard that during the destruction of Saddam Hussein's palace, that his china was looted. And he found this china on eBay, which is a big repository for Michael, from an ex-American war vet and an Iraqi refugee living in Michigan. And he served this meal that he made with Chef Kevin Lasko on the plates of Saddam. And it was this very strange thing because, you know, you might ask where your food is from, but you don't necessarily ask where your plate's from. And it really became about, you know, eating off of the plate of the enemy. And so this idea of thinking about how hospitality and hostility are interlinked are really kind of emblematized in this project. But does the video show the repatriation? So something interesting happened right after this project, which we're going to show you in this video. This is Saddam Hussein, an AP image of the Saddam Hussein's palace. And this is Iraqi date syrup. We're just going to skip to the video.
Best new thing in the world today is obviously the end of the Iraq War. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta saying today in Baghdad that Iraq is now fully responsible for directing its own path. The war ending as it should. Iraq now becoming its own sovereign country without our flag flying over it anywhere, without our troops anywhere in it. That's easily the best new thing in the world, maybe this decade. But there's another Iraq story that is ending as it should. It doesn't beat the end of the war, but it's pretty good. This fall, a Chicago-based artist got together with a New York City arts group and a restaurant. They put together an ambitious, big-thinking art project. They found on eBay dinner plates believed to have been looted from Saddam Hussein's palaces after the U.S. invasion. They bought the plates, and as an interactive art installation, they served on Saddam's flatware and plates venison with tahini and date syrup and pomegranates. The project was called Spoils. The artist said he wanted diners to think about how the plates got to their table. Quote, "This is about the symbols of power in that regime that have now come into the ownership of the populace that were living under Hussein," he told the New York Times last month. But you can't just buy Saddam's dinner plates on eBay. Not legally, anyway. When the art group was formally notified that the plates really belonged to the Iraqi people and needed to be returned, they agreed to give them up. So earlier this week, in what the New York Times described as a strange but cordial visit, the artist helped the U.S. Marshals pack up the plates so they could be delivered to the Iraqi mission at the UN. By Tuesday afternoon, the plates had made their way to D.C., where Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was in town to meet with President Obama. The plates were then scheduled to fly back to Iraq with Maliki on his private plane on Wednesday, which is to say this ambitious, big-thinking art project ended as it should have. The Iraq War is over. Iraq is a sovereign nation. And one of the very small things that means is that they get their stuff back, too. Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Have a great night.
So one of the things you can see about Michael's work is it really explodes beyond the confines of the art world into a kind of broader cultural sphere, which is one of the things that always drew me to Michael's work. Is I feel that sometimes art speaks to a very particular niche audience, and one of the things that I like to do in my exhibitions and projects is to ensure that they reach as broad as possible a public, and especially those that don't necessarily have access to art. And also by being implicated within situations, start to realize that art can take on many different forms. Now there's more projects to talk about, but we have been told that we should open up to questions. But is there anything that you wanted me to show them, What Dust Will Rise video quickly, or because we should open up to questions? So I just want to say, we're going to talk about one more question called What Dust Will Rise, which is a project for Documenta 13, which is the site Michael, which relates to the site in the beginning of the video, and that project is featured in the exhibition at the MCA. So you're very welcome to go there and to get a real sense of the depth of that project. But the project deals with the destruction of an art history and the suturing of an art history using two different sites and two different locations. But if you go to the exhibition at the MCA, you'll have a full sense of context of that in the beautiful installation that Michael's created. But it's time to open up to questions. There's a roving mic. I believe Stephanie has it. So we would love to hear your questions for Michael. Thank you. I can't see, so I don't know if there are hands raised.
Hi. Do you think that a bad guest has the self-awareness to realize he's being a bad guest?
I do, but I don't think that. I mean, in certain situations, I do. I might be a bad guest right now and not know it, but I mean, it's something that that I think is probably really different for different people. I think there's a way of picking up on certain things. I think that that's an interesting question, because I think that it also goes into this realm of a certain kind of social etiquette, which changes from place to place. It's actually a really great question for Anna Pravatsky, who unfortunately isn't here, but she did this beautiful performance as part of the architectural biennial here. But her entire piece for Documenta that year was more or less like, you know, everything from how to react to uncomfortable situations in the world to, like, you know, how you should react to the person who's standing in front of you online and trying to get tickets to Documenta, whose purse smacks your kid in the head, you know, and how do you react to that? But I do think that there was something bigger about those questions that made me realize, like, when Hanan Ashrawi said that when you're in Hebron, you are a guest, it was a really interesting way of putting a different lens on the occupation of Palestine and what more or less those different actors in that situation are performing.
I'm just going to get it to the title slide.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just curious, what did your mother think of the work that you were doing?
Of Enemy Kitchen? Any of the
or
work?
any of the work, yeah. She's still alive.
Yeah, no, thank God she's still alive. She likes it. She likes it a lot. Yeah.
Well, she's also a key collaborator in the work.
Yeah, Enemy Kitchen was very much a discussion with her, and it's a real meditation and immersion in a certain kind of process of craft, but also it's like learning a language. And I'm very ashamed to not be fluent in Iraqi, Jewish, Arabic, but it's another kind of language, just this transmission of recipes. And they aren't necessarily just Iraqi Jewish recipes. It's also like these recipes that are disappearing as things speed up because of economical factors, you know, around the world. And so you have people not paying attention to certain recipes that take all day to cook, for instance. And so that slowing down is really a gift. But it's also, you know, my mother and my grandmother are probably the two biggest influences on my practice. And my mother was the one who opened up my mind to art, but also what profundity was and what poetry was. Took me to museums. She was the one who cried in front of the TV when John Lennon died, and in second grade, I've learned about how that man and his artwork changed the world, you know. And so it started to really bring all these things in together for me. And so it's been a real honor to be able to constantly go back to her and, like, you know, try to cook for her the kubba dish that she teaches me. And she's like, you got me the sauce wrong, you know? And so there's nothing better than the kitchen argument, because it is about learning, because you want to get better. you know? And so those kinds of moments, I think, you know, have really opened up the kind of, you know, it's opened up an understanding for me of the kind of social spaces I want to create, you know, of like, those are the conversations I want to have people have. You know, so for instance, this question of like, you know, you're in my house. You know, like there was once this uncomfortable moment with somebody who had seen that I had used a photo of Saddam Hussein's tongue being checked by the American soldiers after he was caught, you know, to talk about the different senses of taste on the tongue. And she was saying, you know, for me as an Iraqi, that was a very embarrassing image when it came out in the international press. And I said, I know, but I'm trying to create discomfort. That's the whole point. And we got nowhere. And she goes, you're in my house. And I had to just surrender, you know, more or less say, you're right. When I publish it again, I won't put the picture, you know. And so there's those moments that I think are really interesting. It's one of the reasons why I do like Larry David so much, you know, and this kind of like
There's a new season of Curb Your Enthusiasm coming.
I'm very excited, but you know, but you know, those moments of awkwardness, I think, really get at something, you know, and that's why I think that, like, you know, so much of these projects really need to hold that antagonistic moment and that moment of discomfort within the space of comfort in order to kind of like to actually get at something and not just, you know, be seen as simply solving something. I'm interested in the place where problem solving is also troublemaking. I know that's not what you asked, but my mother does like the work.
She's a collaborator. She loves it. She loves it.
You passed over a slide that had a picture of a retail store. I believe it was Davidson.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that project was called Return, and it's a project that I started in 2004, but it really reached its peak for me in 2006. My grandfather was an importer-exporter in Iraq, and he opened up a business in Baghdad called Davison's and Company, and it was because the anglicized name of the family, and the family's name was Daoud, and so David was the anglicized name, and so he had one son, always wanted another, so he called it Davison and Sons, Davison's and Company, and so that business closed in Iraq when he had to leave, and he reopened it in the States when he moved, as a way of staying in touch with his friends in Iraq, you know, who were not forced out. And the business closed in the 60s, and he died in 1975. And so I reopened the company in 2006 to import to the United States for the first time Iraqi dates. Iraqi dates are the best in the world. They're like a Cuban cigar. There's over 600 different varieties. And since the sanctions in 1990, 1991, there hasn't been an Iraqi date in the United States. Actually, even longer than that. And so I decided with a grant that I got from the New York Foundation for the Arts for Architecture and Environmental Structures to try and import 1 ton of Iraqi dates. And I said, that's an environmental structure. It's 1 ton of Iraqi dates. You know? And so the dates ended up traveling the exact same path as Iraqi refugees, where they ended up at the border with Jordan after waiting 4 days in line to get to the Jordanian border to be imported, and then ended up back in Baghdad where they had to get a radiation scan certificate because everybody in the Middle East was more or less of the belief that depleted uranium was used during the war. And when you see what's happened to the Iraqi date palms, there's only 10 million left, down from 30 million. And they're suffering these diseases that actually 3 million that are left, I'm sorry. They're suffering these diseases because of the depletion of their immune systems because of their radiation. And so the dates ended up actually getting scuttled in Syria, where they had actually cooked in the truck for 3 weeks, going back and forth between Baghdad and the border with Jordan, and so it ends up dying in Syria. So it became this allegory for the plight of the Iraqi people. And so I had this store in Brooklyn, in the heart of New York City's Arab community, where I reopened that company, and people coming in and asking where the dates were, and they were getting actually the story of the Iraqi refugees. Quick end to a very long story. the Iraqi company found out that the dates ended up suffering that fate. They airlifted out really expensively 10 small boxes of the Iraqi dates. They got to the States and then the shit hit the fan. And Homeland Security, the FDA, the USDA, they all cordoned it off, quarantined it for a month to make sure that the dates did not have any poison in them because they were coming from Iraq. And the whole point was to challenge this notion of what the United States was supposed to be doing after mission accomplished, which happened in 2004 or 2003, and then shortly after the sanctions fell. But anything that says product of Iraq still doesn't come into this country even to this day. And so the company even went so far as to design the box so there would finally be something that said product of Iraq, and make no mistake, the flag was printed on the side. And so those 10 boxes are the last Iraqi product to actually have been imported to the US.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for the conversation. Hi. I was curious to know how you felt about juxtaposing the Lamassu, which is the Assyrian female deity, am I right? In Trafalgar Square, which is it Trafalgar Square?
No, the Lamassu is actually, it's an Assyrian. Yeah.
But then you're putting the statue in Trafalgar Square, which is London's probably like most touristy commercial area. I wonder how you were thinking about the juxtaposition, or like just to have it in the UK per se.
Well, I think those tensions are right there. You know, the Lamassu that they have in the British Museum from, I believe it's from Khorsabad, are a main attraction in that Mesopotamian section of the museum. And the question of where antiquity has ended up is a big part of my practice and a big part of that project. And it's also part of the film that Omar very generously produced that's in the exhibition called The Ballad of Special Ops Cody. And so having the Lamassu outside of a museum with its ass facing the National Gallery of London and then looking, like I said, towards Nineveh with the hope that it will return is meant to kind of bring up so many of those questions. And, you know, my politics about where antiquity ends up is not, you know, very controversial or even interesting. I despise looting, and I despise also like the legalization of the looting that happened, you know, as the Ottoman Empire was in decline and the Imperial Museum was emerging all around the world. But I'm interested in nuances. And so there was actually a story that Donnie George told me, the former director of the Iraqi Museum. And he was sitting with me and he was telling me, you know, I knew these people in London, these Iraqis who would go to room 56 and they would constantly protest that those votive statues and those things that were there belonged to the Iraqi people. And then the looting happened in 2003, and those same people went to the Iraqi Museum, the British Museum shortly after to make sure those artifacts were still there. And they said that they looked at those and as those antiquities suddenly, not as stolen artifacts, but as refugees like them. How fucked up is that? You know? But that's the place where I want to live with my work. You know, that's the place I want to get at. You know, because it's real and it's complicated. You know, it's not tidy.
I was going to say that also this point is that another point that's interesting about the Lamassu is Trafalgar Square is the #1 site for protest in and around London. So it is where all protesters gather, but it is also the most surveilled area in Great Britain, if not the world. So it's also this kind of has this kind of weird panoptical thing in terms of which actually resonates with the kind of panoptical view of seeing the conflict in and around that's happening in Iraq as well. So there's all these other nuances as well that you could draw out from that very specific project.
And also the fact that it's made from date syrup, that it's about the ecological collapse, the one that, you know, that is not anthropocentric. You know, nobody's been really talking about the landscape of Iraq, which has been completely decimated. You know, but the ghost of those dates making up the ghost of the Lamassu for me is something that I find to be an important layer of the work as well.
You've talked a lot about how sort of ephemerality is a huge part of what you're thinking of and things like that. And so I'm curious about then how that translates into these objects that you're making, particularly with the Lamassu for Trafalgar Square. You talk about these things as ghosts, and I'm wondering if in your production of these items, if you're thinking about archival status or anything like that, like how long are these things actually, but especially given the materials that you're using, like papier-mâché.
We do our best. My assistants and I, one of whom's in the crowd today, Asla, we do spray the newspaper with an acid-free spray that libraries and archival halls use. We do our best. We use also an archival glue, and then we seal things with a UV paste that is made from not very harmful materials, but it's been proven that it doesn't break down. However, I'm also a fan of Dieter Roth, who uses sausage and chocolate. So that conversation has been thrown out the window in terms of how long a thing's going to last. I also love the Japanese tradition of having to rebuild so many of these wooden temples every 60 years. It transmits the skill sets to new generations and constantly keeps those buildings in a space where they're living, they're evolving, they're changing. We shed our cells, and so I feel two ways about it. One, I love the fact that I've had such support from different museums, and in fact the British Museum, where when they acquired a section of that work, they displayed them alongside, their own antiquities, taking into account, and acknowledging the fact that so many of those antiquities arrived at their doorstep through, not so great methods. And their message to me was, you can editorialize, we're not allowed, And so the fact that it ends up in those spaces, there has to be some I guess, guarantee that these things are being made with the idea that they don't decompose so quickly. But that material that I'm using is very purposeful because it's urgent. It probably is not forever, and there's a reason for that, and people were not talking about 3D printing when I started the project, but now this kind of digital colonialism that's happening with these westernized looking East, not looking really to the Syrian people, but saying, what are we going to do to save Palmyra? And finding that they can actually digitally print an entire section of Palmyra wherever they want to. You can't reprint the DNA of the people who are lost. And so the urgency there for me is really purposeful, and that it pushes back against being something that the West can hold and have it be forever. It's a ghost. It's going to disappear like we will. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Last question.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. By the way, it was really, really excellent. I do have a question about the host-guest relationship and where the state falls into that. Is the state the host? Is it the guest? Or can it operate as both?
Wow. I don't know how to answer that. Where does the state fit into that? I mean, I've often thought about what's become these studies that are now known as decolonization studies, way before, and I've thought about the way that, the United States is built on occupied territory, and this question of what is, the host situation. When I was in Australia doing a project for the Sydney Biennial, one of the things that I noticed that everybody did at every public talk was that they started with this acknowledgement of country, or welcome to country, where they thanked and they acknowledged the elders and the original landowners. It ends with realizing that we must always remember that Australia is, and always will be indigenous land. And it's something that's really complicated, and it's like something that's become completely rote and meaningless because it's been emptied out of meaning, in a place like Australia. And I think apology is really a complicated thing about who apology is for. But I've usually started my larger talks, at different public events now with this acknowledgement of country as a way of coming to terms with the fact that, being so invested in Palestine and so invested in this question of the uprootedness of people and the inherent violence of the nation state as an idea. And so I've always kind of put the state into a position where it should be seen as temporary, that we are guests here, but it's also naive, to look at it as something that's going to completely turn in the opposite direction, because Native American culture has been so decimated and continues to be mutilated and objectified, and so I think that there's a certain kind of, impossibility in terms of a complete and total reconciliation there. But in terms of your question, I think it can be both, obviously, but I hope that we get beyond nation state sometime in my lifetime, because I think it's a horrible structure.
I agree with that, and I think that one of the specific strengths of the work is the focus on the individual as opposed to the idea of such things such as the nation state, and when you are presenting them, you're trying to deconstruct them. So for me, I also hope that is the case. Before we end, I just wanted to say that on the occasion of this exhibition, Backstroke of the West, we were very privileged to produce Michael Rakowitz's first ever monographic publication, co-published with Delmonico Postel. It features 10 projects and the new commission. With each single project, there is detailed archival material, so there's a wealth of information, and the cover I think is beautiful because I, pushed for our wonderful designers to do it that way. And I'm going to ask for you to not bombard Michael after this with any questions, because actually we're going to be moving right from here to Rhona Hoffman Gallery's booth, which, do we know what booth number that is?
419.
419?
419, where we're going to be selling these books, and Michael is going to be signing them and happy to make dedications to anybody who asks. So let's let Michael get there, and you can also ask your questions while you have your book signed. And I just wanted to say thank you to Expo, particularly thank you to Michael for this incredible journey. Thank you for this presentation and for allowing us to see you pre-mustache, which was very reminded me of a time, it was a very funny situation, when Michael and I have this Borat impersonation situation that we do between us, and when he walked up at the MCA one day, I said to him, "Is this a joke?" And I was very angry, and I was like, trying to stand up my Borat impersonation. But anyway, that's an aside. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for being here. Thank you.
And thank you.